Hey, how's it going? My name's Mimi and welcome to Climbing Calm. Today's video is going to be something a little bit different. I'm going to be delving in deep into the psychology side of climbing around our passion for climbing, the implications this passion has for our performance, and also, importantly, the role that climbing plays in our lives from a more of a bigger picture perspective. Excited to be sharing with you lots of different things that I've been working on for the last year and a half, and it's also different in the sense that I've had a lot of help from my audience in this, so I'm super psyched. Some of you may remember that at the beginning of the year I shared a survey with my audience delving into what I find pretty interesting in performance psychology, and it's basically looking at what it is that makes us participate in climbing, why, and how we feel about it. The survey was looking predominantly at behavioral science in the context of climbing. Behavioral sciences is basically just the analysis of the psychology behind what makes us do stuff. But most of the research existing in psychology looks very specifically at motivation. And you can break down motivation for any kind of behavior. You can say that there's a motivation to want to take the bins out, there's a motivation to go to the dentist, or to go for a run, or to eat a sandwich. But passion only exists for a certain kind of activity. So this is something that drives us to participate in one behavior repetitively, but we love it, and there are loads of different other factors which I'm not going to get too hung up on. So my survey was looking at passion for climbing, and there are two kinds of passion which exist, and passion can exist for anything from playing an instrument to another sport to climbing. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to use climbing as the example, but you can apply it to a lot of different things if you're watching and you're not a climber. Okay, I'm really cold. Hope you can all still hear me. I was really amazed by the response. I got so many messages back with lots of people being like, oh, I hadn't even begun to think about climbing in the context of my life like this. And I got such an amazing response that I even ended up on the Careless Talk Podcast. Co-host Sam Prior did my survey and got in touch because he was so amazed by the way that he had to think about climbing in the context of life, which is something I don't see too often in the climbing bubble. If you haven't heard of that podcast, I 100% recommend. So I wanted to study passion a little bit more and look at it in the context of climbing, because climbing is an activity that individuals are incredibly passionate about. Now, there are two kinds of passion: obsessive passion and harmonious passion. Now, obsessive passion is a drive to participate in an activity that an individual loves and invest a lot of time and energy in this passion, but obsessive passion specifically is driven by external factors. So for climbing, this might be passion that is driven by wanting to achieve a specific grade, or wanting specific social status, or having external factors like comp prize money or shoes, or other external factors that make us want to do things. In current existing research, obsessive passion has been heavily linked to things like burnout, to things like conflict, and I'm going to talk about what that is in the context of passion in a minute. And obsessive passion also leads to a very heavily imbalance in the participation of the passion activities. If you're obsessively passionately motivated, you're much more likely to participate in the activity to a degree to which it becomes counterproductive, hence the high link to burnout. And a lot of research has commented that although even if you are obsessively passionately motivated, high obsessive passion is also linked to a negative impact on things like important social relationships and a sort of slow self-development. If you're obsessively passionately pursuing something that you absolutely love, you might be compromising by not putting time into important social relationships or personal development. So if you're pursuing climbing to an obsessive level, you're much likely to see this massive imbalance between your passion for climbing and other areas of life, whether that's professional, whether that's social, or family, or other areas. And the second type of passion is harmonious passion. Now, this is the same thing. It's a passion that drives us to participate in an activity and invest lots of time and energy in it, but it is driven by the sheer enjoyment of doing the thing. So it's a lot more internal, wanting to participate in climbing because you just sheerly love climbing. You love the sensory experience of it. You love feeling strong. You like just absolutely perfectly nailing moves, whether that's on trad, bouldering, or sport. You just love actually doing the climbing. Harmonious passion is linked to the desire to participate for the sheer love of it, and it's called harmonious passion because you can have lots of harmonious passion, but it exists in harmony with the other areas of your life. So harmonious passion has been linked to things like well-being, good personal development, a more prolonged and consistent participation in the passionate activities, and things like resilience. If you're harmoniously, passionately motivated, you're just not going to be that fussed by setbacks because you just really love doing the thing. In this context, if it's climbing, if you're just really psyched on actually climbing, you're not going to be that fussed if you didn't send your project that day, because you'd be pretty happy that you managed to get out and you had a nice time climbing and that was what you wanted to do. So conflict is the degree to which an individual feels conflict between different areas of their life. And in the context of passion, it's very relative because individuals might feel like they have a big conflict between their professional life and their passion. For example, if you're really psyched on climbing, you might not be that excited about having to come back from your climbing trip early to go back to work. And vice versa, conflict can work in both ways, in that you might feel like you're pretty tired of your professional life because you've been climbing so much, and that might be what you're focusing on more. So you can get climbing to life conflict, and you can get life to climbing conflict. And this doesn't, I've just used lots of work examples, but this can exist in other areas of life as well, like social. Like you might not be that fussed about going out on a weekend. When I say out, I mean drinking or any other thing that isn't climbing, because you'd rather be fresh for your climbing day on Saturday morning instead. It sounds really nerdy to say out loud, but I know so many climbers that think like this. Maybe I'm projecting, because I definitely do, but that's a tangent. Anyway, so that's conflict, is the degree to which individuals feel like their passion, so in this case climbing, is impacting things like their social life, their professional life, and everything else in between that isn't climbing. So I took all of my survey data, and of all of the people that completed it, which was over 600, I was able to use just over 500 participants. So that's the sample size of this data that I'm now going to talk about. First things first, I found out, shock, climbers are really psyched, which is one awesome thing. We are super passionate. So I took the sample and I divided it up into different psychometric categories, 4 different ones. This would be people who had no passion, whether it was harmonious or obsessive. It was people who had pure passion, so they scored highly in obsessive and harmonious passion. And then the other 2 categories were individuals who scored really high in one but low in the other, and vice versa. And then I took all of this and I firstly looked at conflict, and I actually wrote down some of my findings because I had to get my head around it. So firstly, I'm going to talk about conflict. Now, based on all the existing literature, it widely acknowledges that obsessive passion leads to higher life conflict because you're obsessively pursuing your passion to a degree to which is unhealthy, and it just starts to create conflict with other areas of life. And that's reflected in a lot of passion studies that have looked at behavioral participation, and what happens is you just repetitively participate in activity until you burn out, basically. While harmonious passion leads to well-being and what we predict to be low-life conflict, which is what was reflected in my data in the sample of climbers that completed the survey. People who were harmoniously, passionately motivated didn't experience anywhere near as much conflict compared to individuals who were extremely obsessively passionate. They experience loads of high conflict. I'm not sure if I'm wording this very well, but I'm hoping you're still with me. Now I'm going to get onto the interesting stuff, which is the psychometric profile, so the levels of passion and how they are reflected in climbing performance. I don't know if you guys can hear the plane, but we're gonna... Before I talk about the things that I found from comparing the passion styles to climbing performance, I'm just going to talk about the massive caveat that I feel is so important to put in here. That is, how do you quantify climbing performance? I feel uncomfortable because I'm a climber and I understand how problematic, flawed, can of worms, how, I don't even know what word to use. Because I understand how many problems there are with climbing grades. I feel like they should just be a slight guideline and they shouldn't be the defining factor of climbs, but here we are. this is what people use. So I basically had this problem when I was dealing with how to crunch the data, and it actually took me like nearly 3 weeks. I even had some really helpful PhD pals come and look at my data and were like, oh, you could probably try this, or you could do this. And basically, after lots and lots of ideas and general problem confrontation, I finally found a way to quantify climbing performance. But it's like, how do you compare one bouldering grade, a boulderer's performance, to a trad climber's performance? I feel so aware of the multitude of different physical, psychological, and just general skills that are required in each of those, because they're so different. So how do you compare them? I had a big problem on this one. It was really difficult. Essentially, whilst I was working on a lot of the data, I found in Rockfax's little grade posters that are really helpful. This isn't a plug. I was just using them to refer to some of the sport grades that I find are harder to relate to. Like the US sport grading system just feels alien to me, and also I'm not a trad climber, so it's harder to relate to some of the trad grades, and I was just using it to like transfer. And then I realized that on their wonderful little posters they have this color system, and the color system, when you're looking at how to compare font bouldering grades to V bouldering grades, everything has also been broken down into a color-coded system, which I have named the Bay scale, because this color grading system broke down each climbing grade into 5 different categories, from beginner, experienced, advanced, expert, and elite. And this ran through everything from all of the different bouldering grades to all the sport and the trad. And I thought this is really important to mention because it's an incredibly reductive way to look at climbing performance. Unfortunately, one of the main reasons I did it is it's incredibly hard to communicate climbing performance to a wider performance psychology audience, which was where this paper was going to be shared. So as much as climbers want to read it, I also want the performance aspect to still be relevant to everybody who might read the paper. I still want the performance aspect to be relevant to people who aren't climbers, so it's like somewhat communicatable, but I still feel like I might share how I did this and I might get lynched because trying to quantify climbing grades is impossible. So I broke it all down into beginner, expert, advanced, experienced, elite, because all these letters spell Bay. As you can see the little pictures that I'm going to use as examples, you can see how this breaks it down. But it gets worse. Because of the nature of the survey, I was looking for individuals who were passionate, and obviously passion is a behavioral dictator because it does affect how individuals participate in climbing, which means it should also result in performance enhancement too. Once I had divided everyone up from their different reported highest max grades, unfortunately there were only 9 individual data points in the bottom 2. So I had to completely eliminate those. Unfortunately, you just can't compare 9 data points next to 500 other participants because mathematically it's just not sound, it's just not good science. Which is like a step further into making the data more reductive, because not only have I just wiped the floor on quantifying climbing performance, I then have also made that even more specific by eliminating the first 2. But when we took the top 3 advanced, expert, and elite categories and compared those to the psychological performance style, so that was everything we talked about based on like what, if you're scoring how much on passion style, what does this reflect in individuals' climbing performance? And it was found that obsessive passion did hold a very high relationship with the expert and elite categories, while advanced individuals weren't very obsessively passionately motivated, and the same went for harmonious, that advanced weren't massively harmoniously passionately motivated. So overall you can say that passion, no matter what style, is good for performance. But when you look at the expert and elite categories based on the rest of the sample, they had some more interesting outcomes on the obsessive and harmonious passion. The elite were incredibly obsessively passionately motivated, and the experts were the ones who were more harmoniously passionately motivated. So the elite had this funny bubble of lots and lots of obsessive passion and then a slightly strange relationship with harmonious passion, while the experts had high in both. So there is a small argument to suggest there that extreme amounts of high obsessive passion is good for performance, but I think it's super important to bear in mind all of the other stuff that I talked about previously. The final significant finding that I found from my data was that if you look exclusively at the relationship between obsessive passion and conflict, it is a positive relationship. So as obsessive passion goes up, so does conflict. But if you look at this relationship in the context of harmonious passion, the conflict is lower. So if someone has a high obsessive passion and high harmonious passion, they're going to have a lot less climbing to life conflict than someone with just obsessive passion, which I think is super important. This finding essentially suggests that it isn't just a really clear black and white obsessive passion equals bad outcomes and harmonious passion equals good outcomes. It's a more nuanced mix, that we are individuals with different kinds of passion that drive us to participate in climbing. And it also suggests that some of the more positive outcomes of harmonious passion are more effective, so they have more of an effect on the individual than the negative outcomes of obsessive passion. So although obsessive passion can in extreme cases lead to more bad outcomes that I talked about previously, when you look at passion as a whole, it can have lots of very different meanings and outcomes. It's not just this really clear black and white, this is going to equal bad outcomes and this is going to equal good outcomes. And importantly, when you look at the rest of the literature that has researched passion and the interactions between the two, my findings are reflected in other studies that have been done. To conclude, if we just look exclusively at the findings from my own little questionnaire, there were some very direct implications for our passion styles, or the kinds of passion that we have for climbing, and the outcomes like for our lives and for our climbing performance. So the ways in which we pursue climbing based on which different passions do affect our performance and our lives, which is pretty cool to find out. But I guess the one reassuring thing for me is that a lot of these findings are reflected in the literature that exists already. It's just cool to make these findings in the context of climbing. A lot of the time these studies are done in the context of like musicians' passion or other sport passion. So it's cool to bring climbing up to date with the already existing sport performance psychology literature. While these are significant findings related to performance passion for sports and activities and the wider picture of the implications this has for our lives, I think it's important to remember this is just one tiny study, and although the cool thing is that this data and the results and the findings are reflected in the rest of the research that exists in this very niche tiny little bubble, it is just one little study. I'm going to reference some of the very first studies that looked at this and some of the ones that feel most relevant. Although they're not the only reading I did, I'm just going to reference the ones that feel like if anyone did want to have an additional read, if anyone's feeling that psyched, they're down below. As significant and interesting as these findings are, I think it's really important to remember that it is just one study, but there are some very similar themes in all of the research, most of them being the ways in which different passion styles have repercussions for, firstly, our performance in whatever we are passionate about, but secondly, the things that create these ripples into our lives. So that is really getting into some of the specificity of performance and passion. But I'm just going to finish on a slightly bigger picture approach by explaining one of the fundamental reasons why I designed the survey in the first place, which was, for me, a while ago, I realized unless something extremely drastic happens, unless I do a complete 180, touch wood, I expect to be climbing for the rest of my life. And I realized this, and as soon as I began to think about this more, it did make me want to address the role that climbing played as part of my life. Now, I am in full acceptance that as I evolve as a person, as my life changes, climbing will continuously evolve in what it does for me and how it serves me. For example, the previous 3 years of my life as an undergraduate student, whilst I was really busy and stressed in the periods of life where I just couldn't do anything else other than academia, climbing was purely an outlet and it couldn't be anything else other than that. But then there have been times in my life where I've been pursuing climbing in this borderline obsessive way, and it was this number one priority, and the outcome was like almost self-defining for me, which I also believe isn't very healthy. I'm not in that place anymore, and I think just this general thinking of addressing the fact that I do think I will be climbing for the rest of my life. So hey, why don't we address the ways in which climbing is a fraction of our lives and what it gives us, and how we can best make the most of the outcomes and make sure that climbing is serving us and that we're climbing for all of the right reasons to make it the most constructive and positive experience possible. If it's something that you're putting a huge amount of resources and energy and time and effort into and you're not feeling satisfied or content from that process, I think it's worth looking at, because if it's such a big investment of time and attention, if you're looking at it on a very like effort in, effort out very reductive point of view, wouldn't it be great to get the most positives from it? Now that feels quite deep and pretty out there, but that was my thinking behind designing the surveys, that if we are putting all these resources and time and attention into participating in climbing, why wouldn't we address the role it plays in our lives to eventually figure out the most, and I use this in the most literal term, the most sustainable way to participate in climbing. If you're participating in a way that you are obsessed and it creates this massive imbalance in your life, you're not going to be climbing for a very prolonged period of time. And I'm pretty sure any coach will tell you that consistency is the most fundamental part of performing well in climbing. Even if you just care about performance, which I think is such a big problematic part of climbing anyway, that's a whole separate tangent. Focusing on finding ways in which allow you as an individual to continuously participate in climbing that serves you in the best way is fundamentally probably the best thing you could do for yourself and your climbing. It's a big win-win. I realize I've talked a lot. I definitely don't have all the answers. I have lots of big thoughts, and then I also have moments where I'm like, oh my God, I'm just sat on a rock talking to a camera. But if any of this has resonated with anybody, my time won't have been wasted. I'm going to link specifically the surveys that feel most relevant to what I've read, and I'm also going to link below the chat with Careless Talk Podcast. There's a really fun conversation with Sam and Aidan, and if you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to this channel because subscription is support, and there's going to be loads more videos like this. I am no longer a seriously stressed out and busy undergrad, which is really cool, and I'm pretty psyched to be bringing lots more energy and attention to climbing calm. Subscribe, please comment if you have any thoughts, because this has been a lot of rambling. I'll catch you on the next one. Making this video has made me fully relate to Dave McLeod talking about keto for 4 hours on the internet in a way that I so didn't expect.